Hvala Šajli, izuzetno korisni savjeti koje smo čuli ovde ne samo za zdravstveni sistem, nego ja bih rekao uopšte za biznis. A pred nama je još jedna panel diskusija, tema su humani aspekti razvoja pametnih gradova. Učestvuju Sven Guest, doktorant političke ekonomije na King's College u Londonu, Hartford Wolf, pravnica i šef odeljenja za pametne gradove i regione u KPMG Law u Nemačkoj, Aleksandar Mastilović, zamenik direktora regulatorne agencije za komunikacije Bosne i Hercegovine i Šajli Čopra, savjetnica u oblasti upotrebe tehnologije u zdravstvu i biznis inovacijama. Razgovor moderira Danilo Krivokapić, direktor Share fondacije.
Hello to everybody. My name is Danilo Krivokapić. I'm a director of Share Foundation, and Share is digital rights organization from Serbia. And I'm a lawyer with expertise in privacy, data protection, information security. So let's say my job is to be suspicious towards technology. So yeah, and I really want to thank Shelly for the talk. I mean, you really opened up this debate nicely. You actually answered a lot of my questions regarding the human aspects of smart cities. I mean, technology at all. And of course, I have some questions, but let you rest a bit. Okay, so I would like to start talking with Sven. So, I mean, this panel is about, let's say, smart cities or any cities. They should have in mind individuals rather than just available technology. So, as I said, individuals should be in the center. And I would like for us to hear from you about your expertise, and economics of urbanization, and maybe what are debates about city planning, participative city development, and the like.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much. And one might wonder, what is my expertise with the topic of smart cities? After all, I'm a philosopher and political economist. So I'm more in terms of the bigger picture, but I will now make a quick pitch why this is relevant to the smart city debate, having attended quite many smart city events. And so I have a couple of slides with me. I'm a millennial after all, so I have to visualize some of my remarks. And as a philosopher, they always tend to be a little bit of abstract. So bear with me. When I was first introduced to the topic of smart cities, I came from, again, the very different perspective. I'm a political theorist. And so I was looking at, okay, how can we make a city more participative? Or why do we come up with a smart city as a term? And I feel that the smart city debate focuses precisely only on the smart part. And then I didn't understand that as a philosopher, why do we call it a smart city? And when I then Googled smart cities and a couple of years ago, you come across pictures like this, you know, like this very innovative, very progressive, like sometimes very utopian thinking. And I was like, why are we not talking about this? The city itself, the urban aspect to it, the phenomenon of urbanization. Why do we focus so much on the tech aspects? And the problem of, I guess, being in the last panel is that a lot of this has been remarked already. Technology is not an end in itself. However, it's often treated in the public discourse that way. But for me, it has to start here. We have the greatest invention already out there. A city doesn't have to be made smart because it is smart already. Urbanization, the move of people from rural areas to the city, is already a smart move. It is one of the greatest inventions, and everything we top on top of this is probably innovation, less so of invention. And that's something that we have to understand when it comes to citizens' participation after all. So this is not a term that I coined myself, that it is the greatest invention. If you read Edward Glazer's book, and Edward Glazer is also very involved in the smart city movement now. I think he was at the World Expo in Barcelona himself. The triumph of the city is a genealogy why cities itself are the end and what cities do to human beings living together. So when we talk about smart cities, we have to understand, first of all, a city is already smart, and we shouldn't disrupt it maybe too much, but rather focus on this. And that's what I see my task as a philosopher, to go back to the foundational thinking there. And if you think, oh, this is like a detached, old school kind of thinking, I pick out here a tweet by Mark Andreessen. Some people might know Mark Andreessen. He's like one of the leading, maybe the leading venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. And he tweeted that The Triumph of the City was one of the books that influenced him the most in thinking about the new world. So I do not need to say much more about the need for smart cities or for city and urbanization and for the talk about it. And I urge you to go into the literature to understand what are the forces that lead to urbanization, because then we understand the debates that we had in the last panel. In the last panel, we kind of discussed what are rural areas and what are smart cities and how can they benefit from each other. I personally have a provocative view. For me, a lot of the benefits that we give to the rural areas are subsidizing. We take away a lot of the forces that lead to increasing urbanization. And I don't see urbanization as a problem that we also then have to benefit some rural areas, but rather we have to embrace urbanization. We should be, as the smart city community, urbanists. We want to have more urbanization. And I don't believe that there is this rural-urban divide, but rather that when we kind of subsidize certain parts away to rural areas, we alleviate a problem or alleviate a trend that is necessarily coming. So we're interfering with a natural trend. So if you want to read more on this, Edward Glaser has fantastic work on this to understand what are the forces behind urbanization. And once you understand these forces behind it, you can also then build upon. So this is kind of the framework where I make my remarks about city participation of citizens in city or where I ground them in. For me, the two big ideas that explain urbanization and then explain the human dimension that we want to discuss here is, first of all, cities connect. Because they connect, they are such a powerful tool because they create human bonds, but also they reduce transaction cost. As I said earlier, I'm a political economist, and for me, the most important idea out there is transaction cost. 80 to 90% of any technical innovation can be explained by taking away transaction cost. Uber, Airbnb, all their business model can sound very fancy and complicated. What they do is reduce transaction cost. And a city reduces transaction cost dramatically. And that's why we have to build upon that. And that's also the key, how to get people politically active, because we have them in one spot together. We reduced already transaction cost. And that makes political participation so much easier. So this is like one of the big ideas. The second big idea is human capital. Why are areas such as Silicon Valley so flourishing? Because there's the right culture, the right mindset. One of my colleagues at King's College has a dissertation where he says the Industrial Revolution did not come from institutions or anything else like this, or capital availability, but because there was the right mindset of betterment, of innovation, of growth. And that's what we see nowadays also in Austin, I think. The success model of Austin is precisely that, giving a new competitive advantage, having the right spirit of people. So these are the two things that we have to bolster. Connection between people and building social capital. And for none of them, I have talked about technology so far. Technology can only help us to amplify these phenomena. But for that, again, we have to understand, and in my short opening remarks, I cannot go deep diving into it. But these are the pillars that we have to amplify to make cities a successful model. We'll skip the Black & Decker. Ask me later why I put the Black & Decker there on a slide. Just to conclude, here are the 4 big areas where we can use smart city technologies or ICT to amplify these trends. First, with mobility, reducing transaction cost. Why do people use cars? Well, it's too hard to transact, to do car sharing. Now ICT allows us to do car sharing. I know who wants to go into the same direction. Now, by having reduced these transaction costs, I can make mobility much more efficient and reduce. Also, we have to think here about pricing models. We can discuss all of this. Second, as a city, you have to talk about what is your competitive advantage. Which kind of social capital do you want to build? Austin was very clever in which kind of competitive advantage they saw in the space. Silicon Valley, too expensive, but nevertheless, there needed to be a social hub for innovative people, for progressive people, and that's what Austin fleshed out, and many other cities did. Next one, participation. If you have all the right people there, they want to create. A city planner wants to create a city, I understand. But if you really think about democratizing, you want to give people the ability to design their own neighborhoods, to be in charge. And ICT reduces the communication cost between people, so they can be in charge of their neighborhoods. It's a return to the old ideas of Jane Jacobs. If you walk through your neighborhood, it has to feel like your neighborhood. It's not some technical dystopia or utopia that you want to draw. It has to be a livable city. And that's why I brought up the question of Airbnb. Is it really a livable city if the center is basically rented out to foreigners? Nothing against them, but is it then a livable city? So there's something that participation can alleviate. And lastly, inclusiveness. A city planner, for my taste, has to focus on two things. Mobility, I mentioned that, and affordability. Like, how can it be that many of the major hubs of social capital, London, Berlin, New York, many other capital cities, and of course Silicon Valley, they are just too expensive. They are not inclusive in that sense. So we have to think about ways how to make this social capital available to everyone. And so we have to be returning as smart city community to not only the tech industry, but to urbanism. And the big urban figures that I see out there are Jane Jacobs and Alain Bertrand. So this is what I think is the human aspects to the whole smart city debate, building upon the forces that promoted urbanization and then use ITC smartly to amplify these trends. Because cities are already smart enough, so we should build upon what we already have there, and we should embrace proper urbanism. So I know, sorry that I take some time, but I think a visualization of these ideas is easier for me to walk through, because some of these philosophical points are very hard to convey.
Thank you so much. This was really interesting. One thing that you said really reflected on me is that technologically is empowering people to be in charge, right? In a way, and I'm just looking at it from my perspective. Like when I started doing this job in 2011, doing work on internet freedoms, we were so excited about internet because it gave so much possibility to people. There was Arab Spring at that time, so we believe that technology is a new hope for democracy. But then things changed because, I don't know, a government took over internet technology in some countries, and also people started using internet in a way that now we need new regulations regarding hate speech and so on and so on. So I'm just saying, do you, in this perspective, talking about smart cities, do you see some challenges and risk with people be given a right to be in charge? Yeah?
Well, there are many risks that especially when we think about the internet and participation, there are many risks that you can run into. Now you can find your own niche online. You don't have to connect on the physical space anymore. And the beauty about cities was to connect in space, to connect in real time. And so now you can be in a city, but your community can be somewhere else. And I think this is the big danger. And that's what I think this democratization of the internet has maybe disappointed to a certain degree, because for proper dialogue and discourse, you need in-person meeting, you need a community building, and you need a platform to have this community building. And that's why I think a smart city approach is the right approach, because if you bring the physical community together through ICT, it can actually give you, again, this sense of I can create something even in the anonymity of a big urban environment. If we think about, again, I come from Germany, where it is very unusual for a young person to go into local politics, because what can I change? Very minor and minute details, almost nothing. So for me, this is less attractive. I, of course, go to the capital city and I want to do like the big political wheel, but what you ultimately want to have is that people get engaged on the ground and change the neighborhoods together. And I think this is a way where then the democratization through the internet can actually help us when we decentralize the political structures. So we have to break down the political structures to make this happen. If I talk about, okay, we have to bring the people together in their neighborhoods, they have to have some say in what they can change. However, if a central planner, a city planner, gives the regulations out there, then they are limited per se. They don't have a say. They cannot override. So this is the constant back and forth between regulation and, to a certain degree, centralization. So if we want the internet, or if we want the democratizational forces of the internet to be unleashed, we have to adjust our political structures and our structures of governance. And for me, it is radical decentralization to almost a neighborhood basis.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to continue with Harshit Wolf. So as a lawyer, I need to ask you about this legal framework. So in the past several years, we see a lot of new laws, regulations, trying to regulate technology. Maybe the best example is GDPR, where somebody says that's like the final revenge of lawyers over IT sector or something like that. So also this regulation, I think Germany is now producing the most regulations regarding technology, internet. So my question is, what are the main legal challenges with smart city development? Is legal framework slowing down smart city development?
Well, I think you need at least three main issues to cover and to look after. The first thing is, I guess, the democratic issue. You have to, if you wanted to create a new future, if you want to create a new smart city, you always have to look that you take the people along. So you can't ignore this, because if you need public investments, for example, you need money, and the money comes from the government who was elected. So the democratic issue is the one, the legal framework is the other, and the third is the culture. I want to start with the culture first, because I think if you want to start and create a new smart city or a new future, you need to have a cultural basis for this. The cultural basis is for German, and especially for German looking after administration or for legal frameworks, makes it a little harder to accept that you probably need to know how to get along with insecurity. You need to know how to get along with the area of trial and error processes. A German administration, I mean like a Prussian German administration, has to cope with the issue that they can't put everything into a law. They can't put everything into a legal framework, because if you have, for example, a new smartphone next year, which has new gadgets and probably need new regulation, after a German legislative body comes along with this new law, probably the next technology already arises. So they cope with things from the past. So I think the one regarding the legal framework, the one part for a continental European will be hard to accept, that we come more and more going to the American and the British way of legal system, coming to case law rather than to written law, and coming to guidelines than to each different paragraph. So we need to be not only a digital project management, we need also a fluent project management, even with law. If we do, for example, bigger projects, like in the area I live from, a bigger railway station, it takes about 10-15 years to create. And during that time, the technology progress will come more and more actual. So you can't really, if you start a bigger project, you can't really cope with the issues coming up 5 or 10 years later. So you have to be a very flexible way of coping with legal issues there. And that means you need, on the one side, you need security to get people investing into smart cities. You need secure surroundings for money. You need secure surroundings for the people. But you have to cope with the issue that you need to be flexible to be able to cope with new perspectives. So that is a very hard thing, at least for a continental European, to cope with. And there will be a lot of fear and a lot of problems coming up then.
So maybe one specific question. So if I did my homework right, you were pretty much engaged with surveillance of surveillance in Germany. Surveillance. So the surveillance of security agencies. So you were part of the assembly board, right, or something like that.
You mean that the central intelligence?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, now when we're talking about smart cities, there is a lot of sensors, you know, following people, gathering data about them. So my question is: so this panel is kind of talking about what are the right balances when we are employing smart cities. So maybe what I'm really interested in, what are the right balances when you are talking about privacy on one hand and, let's say, security on the other? Because smart and well surveilled city will increase security on the streets, right? But there are risks for privacy. So this is like I would say, difficult question, but I'm interested in your thoughts.
It's not that easy, the question, that's true. I mean, like if you ask the people, if they wouldn't have any problem seeing the problem. Because they give them the data to Facebook, they give the data to Twitter, they give it to somewhere else. Then it starts to become a kind of a real big lake with all the data owning one or two or three companies, probably the state. Of course, seeing the Patriot Act in the United States, seeing the Chinese intelligence, seeing the Russian intelligence, of course we know that all the data from private companies can be owned by state institutions also, governmental institutions. So governmental institutions are the ones who are able to use power more than probably just the private company. So of course you have to look after the different regulation within your state, but mainly, I guess, we need a regulation on the UN level. We had in the world, we had a regulation on how to do warfare. I think we should think about developing a regulation, or at least a framework, for using data worldwide. And I think the Geneva would be a good place to look after the UN guiding principles on cybersecurity and cyber issues. For this, you need this because the data is coming together in different private institutions, and they will come together with governmental institutions. And if we don't look after them, they can be used in a way nobody can think about it yet. And let's say it this way, they are used already.
Well, just to, that's great what you're saying, because I was in Geneva a month ago. So they just adopted, it's not a regulation, it's an act on privacy in digital age. So let's say UN is seeing this kind, but just a quick question. Do you think that GDPR is a good basis for what you're saying, or don't?
It's a good basis to start with. The interesting part is how it will be lived where the politicians are working with. If you look after the United States right now, not the people there. I differ between the government of Mr. Trump on the one side and the people of the United States on the other side. I'm not sure if this governmental administration in the United States will have the same curiosity looking after the data as others do. Of course, if you see the possibilities on big data, the possibilities of drones, not a drone, I don't know what the drones, yeah, okay, and the possibilities of warfare there. You really need a new way of getting the guidelines done.
Thank you so much. I will leave time for Q&A when everybody talks a bit. So, Shelly, I will reflect on your talk a bit. So, you were talking about how you improved healthcare in a rural area and about all the challenges that you had. And I'm going to ask real Serbian question, because when you talked about challenges in rural area, those are all the challenges that we see in current Serbian healthcare system. So just a quick, do you maybe have some advice for us here?
You know, I was talking about it to several people since morning. I met a couple of folks who are doing some real neat innovations in healthcare tech. And it was interesting as I got introduced and they're talking about, I have this glove, which is for the blind people and that helps translate. And I immediately came down to, if I'm a blind person, what you're talking to me, it just makes me shrug. Not necessarily mean, yes, I get it. You're going to change my life. So I would really start with, you know, I was very intentional in sharing those 8 best practices because at the heart of it, the big lesson for our team was, it is absolutely not about technology, and you said that. Can we make it about people? And that requires a very different mindset than the traditional smart city approach, which, by the way, I agree with you. We had heated debates on the word smart. Why, you know, we're not dumb. We don't need to be smartened up there. The term we favored was connect the cities, because you're elevating, you're improving, you're creating connectedness. So I would say, you know, because you're dealing with culture, you're dealing with changing people's lives, not creating that fancy infrastructure. So can we start by truly taking the time and defining the value at the front lines? And can we be intentional about how we are going to manage the culture shift? You can build the fanciest of bricks and mortars, you can bring in the fanciest of innovations, but if it's not positions where people embrace it, there'll be just one more investment we've made. So investment in managing the culture shift, investment in translating to value that is meaningful and that is embraced would be a really good starting point. And the third one I would say is, can we slow it down? Which is completely anti my technology OCD nature. It's not about a lot of good things. It might be about few good things that are more impactful, that open the doors for other good things to come. So can we be patient and incremental in our change? Because as you pointed out, a lot of this we're figuring it out. That whole big data, that whole trust factor, we don't have all the answers yet. So can we slow it down?
Just probably in addition to this, one of the most important things is you have to be able to, if you want to use health data, if you want to use the possibilities of the technology, you have to know that your data will be used in a trusted way. And if you don't, you wouldn't give your own personal data to somebody else if you know they misuse it somehow. So the important part is the data protection on the one side and the security of the data also. Both issues are very important and work together.
Yes, trust comes with time, and that requires a little patience and wisdom in learning.
Yeah, that comes to my second question perfectly. So you said that transparency is a key to trust.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, everybody using technology should be completely transparent on how they are using data and, of course, personal data. And this is maybe the biggest issue that my organization is having, is like we are trying to be transparent for others, for other companies who are not transparent. And the biggest challenge is that sometimes you think people don't care or they don't even want to know. And then because they don't know, they are even more afraid or what. So how did you overcome this challenge of making people understand what you're doing and make them care about it?
Interestingly enough, my parenting of 2 teenage boys came in handy at that time. You know, with teenage boys, you could be telling them, don't do this, here's what you're doing, and it comes across that probably they're not hearing anything and they don't care. And most times they don't. But then that accident happens, that car crashes, and they're going to remember mom said to call this number and do this. I think the approach we took on building the transparency was, you're absolutely right. When we got all the data and big data in, one of the approach we took was we really became transparent on what we did not know. So, and that was a little bit difficult to go admit to people who are not trusting you already, who are already doubting your credibility, to go back and say, we've gathered all the health data from the constituents, we've gathered the data from payers, competitors. Here's what we're seeing as the problems with the data quality. So we want you to know, yes, this data is not perfect. Yes, there are data quality issues. This is what we're doing to resolve it. No, we're not going to fix it. And no, it can't be fixed overnight. Here's how we're going to incrementally fix it, and invite them in to be part of the process. We also went and right from the beginning created a transparent communication on, here are the risks with that data. You're right, this makes us vulnerable, that if this data was hacked into, that, for example, for the competitors, they can see each other's pricing models. That was a big thing in the US when you're bringing in the healthcare data. For the patients, you brought in data from my Fitbits, my health devices, my healthcare records, and there's some data such as the psychoanalysis data that is supposed to be very private, that in our big data lake, as much as our technology claims it's safe, the reality is it is vulnerable to be hacked into. And we had to own to that, and we had to face the criticism. But our transparency and our willingness to work through it did pay off in the end, where people saw there is no quick fix to this problem. And the only way we're going to work through it is working together. So I don't know if I answered your question. There is really no good answer, except that you have to admit it's not perfect. And it probably will not be, because by the time you solve one problem, you're steps ahead and you have to solve the next one.
Thank you. So I'm just going to switch to our language for a little while, talking with Aleksandra Mastilović. Aleksandre, da možda krenemo sa malo nekom, da kažemo, pozitivnom notom. Dakle, čini nam se kada na Balkanu pričamo o konceptima pametnih gradova da smo nekako dosta daleko, ali ti si učestvovao u jednoj dosta uspešnoj inicijativi u Istočnoj Sarajevu, možda malo da podeliš to sa nama.
Pa hvala na tom pitanju. I apologize because as I see we don't have translation here, maybe would be because actually I wanted to discuss something about the term smart later, but okay, we can turn and continue later in English. Što se tiče ove inicijative, mene je danas ostalo u glavi jedna rečenica koju je rekao gradonačelnik Beograda, to je da je na temu pametnih gradova generalno potrošeno puno riječi i da u nekoj dimenziji konačno treba da ispričamo neke konkretne priče. U tom smislu projekat koji je realizovan u Istočnom Sarajevu predstavlja jedan od prvih konkretnih pomaka u smislu realizacije nekih pametnih servisa. Ono što je jako dobro, taj projekat je rađen u potpunosti usaglašeno svim nekim strateškim politikama i planova Evropske unije i finansiran na strani programa Interreg Med Evropske unije u sklopu programa, znači, zelenog održivog razvoja, rast, znači, fokusom da se postignu određena unapređenja u oblasti uštede energije i naravno pametna rasvjeta je došla kao prirodan put u tom pravcu. Ja, evo sada, pošto ovdje imamo i prevod, onda ja mogu da se dotaknem one teme koje sam htio, evo nastavit ću naravno na srpskom. Tu treba da uzmemo pojam smart, da ga uzmemo, odnosno riječ pametna. Šta to zaista znači? Ovdje se provlačimo, da li smo zaista pametni? Ja sam sad ovdje u poziciji inženjera, naravno kolege su iz nekih drugih oblasti, ja bih sad otvorio i tu malu priču da pokušamo definisati zašto nam ova priča čitava treba. Mi ne donosimo tehnologije zato što je to lijepo. Možda zato što to onako moderno, da ubacimo nekakve tehnološke novotarije, igračke u svaku moguću sferu života, jer će to tako da ostavi neki dojam nama ozbiljnosti ili veće vrijednosti. Mi to radimo zato što to postaje neophodnost. Ja možda tu nisam do kraja, ne slažem se s kolegama kada kažem da smo mi dovoljno pametni. Možda za ovaj trenutak jesmo, ali evo ako pogledate recimo jedne od predikcija Ujedinjenih nacija o pravcima razvoja urbanog društva, kažu da će 2050. na planeti živjeti preko 9 milijardi ljudi, da će migracije stanovništva u pravcu urbanih centara preći 75% ukupne populacije i da će neki od gradova, naročito kažu, predviđaju, mislim da je indijski grad, Kalkuta, ako sam dobro zapamtio, da bi trebao da probije broj od 50 miliona stanovnika. I naravno, ako vam kažem da New York neće biti među 20 najvećih u tom trenutku prema tim predikcijama, da postaje jasno da imamo posebne izazove. Spustimo te izazove na običan rječnik. Da li mi možemo da obezbijedimo adekvatnu infrastrukturu sa današnjim konvencionalnim pristupom, praktično skoro pa naslijepo, procjenjujući prema nekim upitnim parametrima koje imamo, da možemo da planiramo saobraćaj, odvoz smeća, zdravstvenu zaštitu, da rješavamo bilo koje probleme urbanog življenja na način kako danas živimo. Dalje, imate tu i sociološke efekte, dolazak nove generacije. Lično sam svjedočio da djeca od godinu, dvije, igrajući se telefonima svojih roditelja, prije nauče da otvore YouTube i crtani film, pa tek onda nauče govoriti, pisati i sve ostalo. Da li će način kako ti ljudi budu se razvijali sa tog aspekta, pa da kažem i mentalnog zdravlja, razmišljati na isti način? Imamo regulacione zakonske dileme. Ko je odgovoran ako samovozeći automobil, automatizovan auto, ubije nekoga ili ozlijedi? Ko je pravni subjekt, legal entity koji će biti meta pravne sankcije? Tu ne možete više ni programera optužiti ako imate vještačku inteligenciju, algoritme matematičke koje evoluiraju. Oni mijenjaju način kako donose odluku, kako vrijeme prolazi i da kažem pamte, skupljaju podatke. Čitav koncept pametnog grada. Zato vratim se neku definiciju koja je prihvaćena. Pametno znači bazirano na ICT-u, na informacijno-komunikacijnim tehnologijama, ali nije to jedini termin. Connected cities je isto vrlo interesantan termin, ali nije samo povezan, mi idemo i dalje. Konačni cilj su oni održivi gradovi što je definisano u cilju 11 Ujedinjenih nacija među ciljevima održivog razvoja. Cilj 11 je održiva zajednica, ali ima nešto i dublje. Gdje je u stvari dodatna vrijednost? Ono što vi diskutirate, to su podaci. Analizom tih podataka, ono što nazivamo big data, analizom tih podataka, primjenom naprednih matematičkih algoritama, mi možemo da dođemo do korelacija veza, onoga što predstavlja dodatnu vrijednost, dodatno znanje koji nama na prvi pogled uopšte nisu očigledni. I mi kao ljudi, kao naučnici nećemo povezati činjenicu da ja recimo mnogo više pijem vode kada je, ne znam, oblačan dan nego, ne znam, kada je nešto drugo. Ili više volim plavu boju sunčanim danima. Znate, to su neki naizgled nekorelisani podaci. U tim naizgled nekorelisanim podacima kriju se mnoga znanja. Ti podaci koji se pripremaju za dalje analize, oni u suštini mogu biti anonimni. I to je onaj dio koje regulatori i, kažem, države kroz zakone trebaju da riješe. Mi nekada je dovoljno, imamo statistički podatak o broju, u stvari, kad kažem broj u opštem smislu, u nekoj metrici na koji način ćemo kvantifikovati i odrediti koliko je neki proces opterećen i na koji način trebamo da na optimalno alociramo resurse u tom trenutku prema realnoj potrebi građana. Naravno, da ne dužim dalje, primjera je mnogo. Da li je pravac saobraćaja u gradovima kada ih planirate u jutarnjim satima isti kao pravac povratka sa posla? Odlazak iz rezidencijalnih naselja u poslovne zone grada dalje. Da li autobus i gradski saobraćaj treba jednak raspored da imaju tokom cijelog dana? Sve su to znanja, neke, aj kažem, formati, trendovi koje mi možemo da upratimo i onda je naravno svijedno koju aplikaciju ćemo pronaći da postignemo veće zadovoljstvo građana, a naravno zbog njih sve to radimo.
Hvala puno. Evo pa jedno lokalno pitanje, dakle, da li misliš, imaš iskustva malo i po regionu, da su države naše na Balkanu na neki način sposobne, odnosno da imaju kapacitete da razvijaju pametne gradove po meri građana? Dakle, postoje tu različiti rizici, evo mislim ja ću navesti možda zanimljiv primjer iz Beograda, dakle trenutno se radi nabavka i implementacija projekta Safe City, koji je zapravo projekat koji služi da se ceo grad pokrije pametnim video nadzorom, odnosno kamerama sa tehnologijama prepoznavanja lica, i to jeste sa neke strane poboljšanje tehnološko i tako dalje za rad policije i takvih nekih stvari, ali prosto postoje, pogotovo u ovakvim, da kažemo, društvima, ja bih rekao sa krhom demokratijom na Balkanu, ogromni rizici za korišćenje tehnologije, tako sofisticirane tehnologije od strane država. Pa, dakle, da se vratim na moje pitanje, da li misliš da naše države na Balkanu imaju kapaciteta da implementiraju ovakve gradove?
Ja ću na pitanje odgovoriti kratko da. Znači, nešto što je doza optimizma je nešto što moramo da vjerujemo. I na kraju krajeva ovo što smo ovdje napravili, naši prijatelji širom svijeta koji su danas ovdje sa nama, daju nam taj kompliment, potvrđuju nam da mi nešto vrijedimo, da mi ovdje imamo nešto da ponudimo. Naravno, evo i ova diskusija koju smo sada ovdje sama daje jedan odgovor. Naravno, našim kolegama i prijateljima se zahvaljujem što su došli iz raznih država ovdje, odvojili svoje vrijeme. Naravno, vidimo po onome što su nam ispričali koliko su zauzeti, koliko rade. Potpuno je jasna bojazan da bilo koje rješenje tehničko-tehnološko i generalno naučno može biti zloupotrebljeno. Kada je Nobel napravio dinamit, nije ga pravio da bude osnova za pravljenje oružja 20. vijeka. Pa su ljudi naši način to okrenuli. Atomska otkrića su napravili atomske bombe, ali nisu zbog toga rađena. Mi možemo i lijekove iskoristiti kao otrov. Ako želimo, mogu biti fatalne po ljudskim organizama, mogu da liječe bolesti. Tako i informaciono-komunikacijne tehnologije mogu biti rješenja, a mogu biti dodatna pošast ili problem u našem društvu, ako se naravno zloupotrebe u tim kontekstima. Zato je jako važno da imamo tu vrstu sprege onoga što u Europskoj uniji kroz svoje politike stalno forsira taj model multi-scale holdinga, odnosno okupljanja različitih interesnih grupa, da se onemogući da samo vlada, odnosno government, taj moment donosi samostalne odluke, nego naravno da tu budu potrebe ostalih sektora, prije svega se misli na industriju, akademiju i naravno na građane, odnosno taj civil society, kako nazivaju, da stalno postoji taj feedback da li građani to žele. Ne trebamo ni taj projekat dočekati isključivo na nož. Evo ja ću podijeliti jedan svjež primjer, naravno ljudi u Bosni i Hercegovini su ga bolje ispratili medijski, možda i u regiji. Nedavno se desilo ubistvo djevojčice u Mostaru, koja je kćerka dekanese jednog od fakulteta poznatih, i tako da ona kao javna ličnost to je odjeknula onako medijski, čak je, djevojčica je sahranjena na kraju u Beogradu iz nekih poročnih razloga. Međutim, sad je problem policiji da istraži taj slučaj. I sva informacije koje imaju vezane su za kamere koje su praktično postojale na objektima slučajno. Kafićima, benzinskim pumpama, poslovnim prostorima, u nekom dijelu grada gdje oni rade. I oni su za sada slijepi, to je sve što imaju. Mi ne možemo ignorisati da u tim situacijama sva javnost vrlo zainteresovana da se otkrije istina šta se desilo. Tako da, ako ih koristimo za te namjene, imamo tu priču. Naravno, da li će to biti korišteno, da vlast učvrsti svoju poziciju, da uguši demokratsku slobodu razmišljanja, da li će ti podaci biti prodavani, da li će se praviti manipulacije sa slikom lica pa prenošeno softverskim alatima u neke druge kontekste i neke druge video sadržaje na mnogo idealan način, da je to teško otkriti, to je moguće. I ne možemo predvidjeti da li mi danas, ako se bavimo naučno-istraživačkim radom, kreiramo bilo kakvu inovaciju, na jednom trenutku neće imati svoj nus efekat. Međutim, to nikada nije zaustavilo ljudsku civilizaciju napreduje. I ja ću sad u stvari da dadnem onu pojentu. Pričali smo o smart city, o connected city, o responsible cities, o mobility, o sustainable cities. Ono što nama treba je pametno društvo. Znači, pametni gradovi su vizija kako nešto treba izgledati, ali ono smart society, ta takozvana peta revolucija, vi ste imali prvu, drugu, pa kažu sad četvrta industrijska revolucija, imate informaciono doba. Doba kada je biznis pokrenut na podacima. Sve se vrti oko podataka. Google je biznis napravio na osnovu podataka, onoga što mi njima ostavljamo tamo. I stvorili su milijarde. Ali peta, kažu, revolucija će biti puno više netehnološka i puno više antropološka, sociološka, pa možda čak aspektu i pravne regulacije. I mi u stvari treba kao društvo da se samo regulišemo, postavimo odgovorni prema onim alatima, sve moćnim u ruci koje držimo, koje na kraju krajeva mogu da unište ovu planetu u konačnosti ako ne budu stavljeni u pravi kontekst. Tako da sa tog gledanja ja ću isto citirati nešto što jako često volim, stavljam na sve svoje prezentacije, to je Bruce Schneier, jedno od vodećih imena oblasti cyber security u svijetu, poznat bloger u toj oblasti. On voli da kaže sljedeću rečenicu, znači da sve one koji misle da tehnologija može da riješi sve naše probleme, samo tehnologija ništa drugo. To pokazuje da onda vi ne razumijete ni tehnologiju ni probleme s kojim se suočavamo. Tako da ta rečenica je vrlo aplikativna i mislim da objašnjava puno ovoga o čemu smo danas počeli govoriti.
Hvala puno. Before I give floor to the questions, do you maybe want to reflect on something that some of you said, some of the panelists? Okay. So it's sure.
Yeah, what comes to, in the discussion a little bit out, but still comes in the discussion too short, is the aspect that it is ultimately a disparity between what we want to aspire in smart cities and what actually the needs sometimes are. So I do this on a global scale, and then we have the best practices sharing, like for example, from Vienna, and then I go to Abidjan, and like, what can you implement there? What I see as a problem in the smart city debate is that there is a potential for political hijack. So some politicians bring out a smart city project, they say we can also do this, and we are therefore now a smart city. They bring forward the smart lighting or the smart bins whatsoever, but does it necessarily improve the lives of people on the ground? I would question that in many cases. It also has shown in many cases that it doesn't work out the way it is planned. And so we have to move away from this showcasing and saying, okay, we have to implement that from a political will. The political will has to put it forward, but rather to say, actually, what are the needs and how can we complement and amplify the things that are not there yet. So for example, the technology allows us a lot of reduction of transaction cost, as I said in the beginning. Not everybody has to own a hammer or a drill or whatsoever. And that allows us to reduce, for example, the need for flats or the space of flats. However, regulation is too slow for this. In London, for example, there are regulations how big a flat has to be, and that limits housing artificially. So small flats or tiny houses or whatsoever are outside a regulatory framework, and we have to think again, okay, not how how we can implement it to everything, but rather what is the initial problem and how can ICT help us to solve these problems. And I think there's so much low-hanging fruit that is not even captured or not fleshed out because we focus already on the debates that are up there. And for many, I would say now 65–70% of the communities are not even on the table.
I wouldn't be that pessimistic as you are. I think, of course, every process to become a smart city or at least a smart society needs always a kind of evaluation circus and process again. You have to always have a trial and error process. You always have to see, does it really work? Does it really fit the needs of the people or not? In a democracy, that is easier because that's part of the process. Every 2 or 4 years. I mean, it's no wonder the smartest city are all over in China or in Singapore because they don't have a democracy as we have, because they have not the evaluation process as you said that they are important. I think they are important, so we are not that far away. But I think at least in a democracy, you got this process within, and you have to, of course, see that the politics will probably have once in a while invest in the wrong direction. That happens, of course. You see it in a lot of different areas, but the people will tell them if they invested in the wrong direction, at least at the next election part. So I'm a little bit more positive as you just described it. I think there is a kind of a checks and balances, especially not only democracy, but also the judicial system will look after. You are not allowed to use everything, and you're not allowed, at least in the European way of thinking, you're not allowed to use every instrument which is possible. On the judicial side on the one side, and the other side is even on the cost issue.
I think it's a great point, and it allows me to push back a little bit more even, because I tend to think this shows a little bit of the problem that we have in the smart city debate, is that also our look is now to China. Oh, they can implement a lot of these smart city tools because who can plan for whom in China? It's very obvious who plans for whom there and who should plan for whom in, I would say, a more free society. In a freer society, a city is perceived not as something that is planned, but something that is an organism that grows by citizens' needs and by interaction. And this emergent structure is something that we should encourage, and that's why I think where ICT plays its biggest role. I love all the ideas about smart lighting and smart bin, and like they all have their place, but ultimately you want to transform a city into the organism that can grow according to the needs and changing shifts and attitudes of people. If we, however, go through the way of letting central planner or urban planners to interfere even more, of course we can carry out much of these smart city projects because it's easy to implement from top down. And so this is the 2 radical ways how the smart city debate can develop. Either it moves more towards more tools for urban planners to centralize the process of urban planning and urban life, and then we go into the Soviet direction, I would say, where we see specific views of city. If we walk through a Soviet city, there is a certain vision behind it, the vision that is played out by the urban designer, versus an organic, messy city that we sometimes see in the city of Boston. It's messy because it's more organic. And so we have to see which direction do we want to take in the smart city debate. And I think that's a very interesting debate to have, especially when we talk about the human aspect of the smart city.
I just mean the main debate and the main point will be, who are the needs of the people? Who is the individual needs? And if you come from this direction, I think you don't have to be fearing too much. Even I think the Chinese system won't work on the long run, because they're probably the difference between the governmental thinking about the needs and the needs of the people themselves. And I think the most important part is to put the people's needs and the people's belongings, like especially healthcare, a clean environment, mobilities, and so on, in the focus of your political debate. And then I think the democracies are further ahead than every dictatorship.
Thank you for this debate. So I'm open for questions.
Hi, again, a question for Sven. The Black and Decker, was it a social experiment, or there is some deeper meaning behind the slide?
Yeah, the Black and Decker. So if I would ask you, how many of you own a drill? How many of you have a drill back home? Okay, quite many. How often do you use that drill? Maybe once a year. So I'm a philosopher. I own a drill. Like, I wouldn't even know how to use it, I guess. Like, but I thought I would need it at one point because there was a bookshelf that I had to put there. Okay, and why do I own this thing now? I don't understand. But then I understood the concept of transaction cost. I bought this because I didn't want to ask all around in my house who owns a Black & Decker right now that I could borrow for a couple of hours. And that's why I own it and then store it away. That's explained why we have and own so much tools, because we didn't have the means available for us to reduce the transaction cost to get at the downtime of these tools. And that was also the problem now, taking away from this trivial example of the drill to the car. Most cars are used with the occupancy rate of 1.2 or 1.3 people. Well, problem is transaction cost. We don't know who goes into the same direction at the same time slice as us. Now we have car sharing apps or Uber that allow us to monetize this and use the resource, the unavailable resource, namely the space in the car, more effectively. So that's what I wanted to visualize. It's a point about transaction cost.
But this is a very important issue. We had just, I'm a member of a city council, and we had one person who had candidate for the president, and he said to us, he's for sharing economy. And we said, well, fine, sharing economy is the future. We need sharing economy on a private basis. Now he said, on a state basis, by force. And we said, huh? What do you mean with that? That means, yeah, for each street row, we just need one car. And we said, okay, but liberal size, no. We give it as a law that this street has just one more car. And we said, what? You wanted to start a kind of a sharing economy, communistic system to make sure that all the people in this one street are allowed just to use one more car. I mean, he's a green one. In Germany, he seems to be not very communistic, but still, that's what that means, to take the people on a democratic way with you, because having sharing economy with the possibilities on this side and having a state keeping with law and keeping with instruments on pressure, or probably on more so-called intelligent way of living in the future. I'm always suspicious if somebody tells me what is the state intelligence to live in the future then. So sharing economy is fine, but please on a liberal way.
Yeah, I think there's a change in generations now. Like we see amongst millennials that there is the ownership property holding is less of vogue. So there is no desire to buy a house, ultimately to buy a car, because you are more used to the opportunity that now ICT provides you all these opportunities to share the resources. So once we put on the software to help us to coordinate, it will kind of naturally come. I also disagree that this has to be enforced, but ultimately we have to accelerate that process by finally taking the bold step of pricing things. Why is there congestion? Because we make driving for free. If you can drive on a resource all the time and there is no pricing that can discriminate amongst usage that is more productive and less productive, and it's basic economics, you will have an overuse. It's an overuse of a common resource. So once we have common resources such as infrastructure, we have to be bold enough to price this. And once we have so much declining prices for all sorts of other things, we will have a natural shift towards more sharing economy, but it's much more organic. But for that, we have to be more courageous and put prices on things. Putting prices on things is nothing bad. It's just a signal of how much people desire to use a certain item or a certain service at one time. And I think that is the road forward.
So I want to thank to all the panelists and to the audience. This is the last panel. Bravo for you staying this late. So thank you very much. Thank you.